Now I don't know how many of you know this, but I recently attached a 3 horsepower motor to my mini mill. It's heaps more power than the old motor, and by my calculations, you can't really notice the new motor unless you're really looking for it. Now for drilling holes, this motor is perfect. The old one would stall out drilling anything larger than about 12mm, and this one easily does 16. And in terms of milling, I can now mill a 20mm thick piece of steel with about a 2mm step over, which is really impressive for such a small milling machine. The problem I'm now facing is that anything more than that, and the machine feels like it wants to shake itself apart, and generally speaking, that is not a good thing. Now realistically, this machine is just at its limits, and I should respect those limits and stick with the 2mm cuts, but you know me, and I really want to push this thing beyond its limit. And thankfully, I think there's one or two things that I can do to the milling machine, which should allow me to push it even further. Now the ultimate goal here is to reduce the vibrations in the machine, particularly in the head where the spindle is. And there's going to be several ways that we can tackle this, but the two areas that I'll be focused on are going to be mass addition and vibration damping. Now adding mass is pretty straightforward. If we make the milling machine heavier, then the forces that are causing the mill to vibrate are going to have a much smaller effect. And you'd be pretty surprised with just how much empty space there is in the milling machine, space that can be filled with something nice and heavy. We can also focus somewhat on material damping. We can select materials that are really good at converting vibration energy into heat. Materials such as lead or rubber, for example, are really good at doing this. And it also goes without saying, the materials should be easy to get, easy to use in a home workshop, and affordable. Now, like the Epoxy Granite lathe video, I'm going to be making use of aluminium oxide powder, which I'll be bonding together with epoxy resin. There isn't a huge amount of info on how well it dampens vibrations once you mix it with epoxy resin, but it is really dense, and that's going to be really good for adding mass. Going off the numbers, it's about double the density of sand, and that's why I'm using this rather than sand. However, a lot of people do use sand, and it seems to work just well for them. Now, in addition to using the aluminium oxide, this time I'll also be making use of lead. Lead is about 3 times as dense as the grit, but it's also great at damping vibrations. And in the event that I ever swap out the 3 horsepower motor for a nuclear driven turbine, the lead should also shield me from any harmful radiation. The only real downside to using lead is just how expensive this stuff is. I have about 20 kilos here, and that's about $230 of it. This stuff just isn't cheap, but it's definitely worth buying. I also have an old cast iron brake rotor that's been sitting around doing nothing for years. I might as well cut it up and add it somewhere. It's nice and dense, and it should be good at absorbing vibrations. All in all, I'm looking at adding about 30 to 40 kilos of mass to the milling machine. It definitely doesn't sound all that much, but remember the milling machine only weighs about 100 kilos from the factory, and it should make a huge difference. So the first thing I need to do is pull the machine apart. I need to be able to access under the base, behind the column, and inside the head, and I can't really do that with the milling machine fully assembled. Not sure how well you can see that, but the scraping that I did back in January is working really well. The low spots are holding oil and are appearing much darker than the cast iron. Overall, good stuff. Now the rest of the disassembly is pretty straightforward. The head is held to the lead screw nut by 2 bolts in the housing, and once those are out, the head simply lifts off. And that's the underside of the base and the back of the column. As you can probably see, there's a huge amount of empty space, and that's space that can be potentially filled up with something very heavy. Now before I start to fill anything up, I am going to make a wall just to make a boundary so I can keep everything separated from the lead screws and the ground-in surfaces. And some 1/2 mm aluminium sheet does a good job at that. Just cut it up with a pair of sheet snips and roughly bend it to shape. It doesn't have to be perfect, just good enough to hold shape and contain everything. And whilst I'm at it, I might as well cover up any through holes. The base will be getting filled with resin and I don't want it to leak out. I also did the same thing to the column, but as it turns out, there isn't all that much space in there, or at least not as much as I initially thought. And with that done, I'll now fix it in place with some liquid nails. It should keep everything roughly in place, and it should make a liquid tight join in order to keep the epoxy in. And of course I ran out of liquid nails about halfway through, so I finished it off with a bit of silicone that I had open. Now because I have so much free space in the base of the milling machine, I'll be filling that up with the metal. The only concern that I have is that it might be a bit difficult to get a really tight pack. So I'll start off with the cast iron brake rotor, which by itself weighs just over 6 kilos. Obviously I can't put it all in as one piece, so what I'll do first is I'll cut it up into a few smaller pieces. And whilst I'm at it, I have a bunch of offcuts that I'll probably never end up using, and I'll use those to help fill up the base and add some more mass. Now obviously I'll try my best to pack everything as tightly as I can, and if I do it correctly, I think I should be able to get between 10 and 12 kilos of mass added to the base. And even though I was trying as hard as I could, there is still a fair amount of empty space here. So to help get rid of that empty space and add a bit more mass, I'll be adding garnet and resin. The garnet will help add mass and the resin will help bond everything in place. Speaking of which, the resin I'll be using here is going to be polyurethane, and I'll be using that instead of epoxy. The only reason why I'm using this is because I've had this stuff sitting around for 3 or 4 years now, and I've had no use for it, so I might as well use it here. Now this stuff here is good resin. It doesn't shrink by all that much, it has pretty good physical properties, and as well as that, it doesn't put off any awful gases. The only real issue that I have with it is that it starts to cure after about 2 minutes, and it's for that reason why you wouldn't want to use this for an epoxy granite. You have to work with the epoxy granite to work it into the machine casting, and that would start to cure way too fast. But in this instance, I'm just pouring it in, so I think this resin should work. And of course, we can all pretend that it's not leaking. Alright, with the base now done, we can now focus on adding mass to the column. And that's going to be filled with some epoxy granite. Well, sorta. The hardware store was unfortunately out of epoxy resin in large quantities, and the only thing that I could find in a big enough jar was this fiberglass resin. And generally, if they don't specify what type of resin it is, it's always going to be polyester. And if you've ever used this stuff, you'd know just how nasty the off-gassing process is. I used to work with this stuff a lot, and I mean this stuff will clear out an entire workshop. It's that bad. Plus, it's not really my first choice for embedding stuff. This stuff does tend to shrink, and it is quite brittle, but I think for small scale epoxy garnet, this stuff should be okay. Just okay. I just made sure to do this at the end of the day, so I could give it overnight, plus a whole day in order to properly cure and stop off-gassing. And after giving it about 2 days, it was mostly cured. I definitely got less in the column than I would have hoped for, but I think I still got about 3 or 4 kilos of extra mass, and that should help make the difference. The final thing left to do is tackle the head, and as you can probably see, there is a lot of empty space which we can fill up. Not to mention the head is going to be our main source of vibration, so we want to do everything that we can in order to tackle it. As you can see, there is a lot of space where the old motor used to be housed, and there is also a lot of space behind the front cover. However, I can't just go in and fill it up with epoxy granite, as much as I would really like to. I need to be able to access the inside in order to bolt the head to the lead screw, plus the worm assembly and the rack and pinion that operate the quill is all exposed on the inside, and that needs to be protected. Now I do need to make a new bottom cover in order to keep the dust out of it, so I think what I might do is I might attach the weight to the cover and see if it works. Now the new cover is just a piece of thick steel plate, and the steel plate will easily bolt to the head using the old bolt locations, which I'll drill out and tap for a larger M8 thread. I'll then get some 16 gauge sheet metal and cut out a pattern which I can then bend and weld to the cover. With that done, I can now start to fill up the container with lead. Lead which I'm going to melt in the furnace. And just to make my life a bit easier and safer, I'll only be melting about 4 to 5 kilos of lead at a time in order to make handling it a little bit easier. Also goes without saying, when dealing with molten lead, please use a proper respirator to deal with the fumes that this stuff will spit out at you. And once I filled up the container, it now has about 14 kilos of lead in it. I still have about 6 kilos of lead left over, so I'll get some smaller box section steel and then fill those up with the remaining lead. The boxes will fit neatly behind the cover, and to keep them in place I'll use some liquid nails. and any lead left over, I'll glue in the remaining space in the column. And whilst all that dries, I'm going to quickly DIY up a chip and coolant tray, which will go underneath the mill. I've been meaning to do that for a while now, and if I don't do it now, with the mill fully disassembled, I probably won't do it for another 2 years. It definitely was a last minute addition, and frankly I don't have any of the tools to do large bends in sheet metal, but it should do the job just fine, even if some of the bends are a bit, well, wonky. I'm also going to add a bit of rubber to the back cover. It tends to rattle about a bit, and the rubber should do a little bit in damping the noise. I also think that sometime in the future it might be worth coming back and scraping the gib in order to get a better contact patch. There isn't a huge amount of contact currently, but I forgot that the gibs are made out of a white cast iron, and as a result it is a lot harder. So instead of spending a few hours scraping the gib now, what I might do is get a power scraper sometime in the future and then come back and scrape it a lot faster. With everything now dried, we can now start to get the milling machine back together. Obviously doing this is pretty straightforward, except everything weighed a lot more than it did when it first came off. And whilst I was at it, I made a new cover for the front, given that the old one stuck up a little bit too far because I'm not using the old milling machine top. And that is the milling machine back together in one piece. Thankfully it doesn't look all that much different to what it looked like before. Now in total we added about 36 kilos in mass to the machine, and that's 36 kilos plus the 20 kilos in the new motor and bracket, plus about 10 kilos in the stiffening plate. Altogether, the new milling machine is about 60% heavier than it was brand new. And with all that added mass in the head, you can definitely feel that it's a bit more difficult to crank at the handle, but it's not by all that much. It's not going to wear you out, at least compared to before. The real question is, well, how does it perform when milling? Well, thankfully the upgrades have done really what they were supposed to do, and that's cut down on vibrations. On the low end, I can now do very light cuts with very little worry that the spindle is going to bounce around. That was a 20mm depth of cut and a 1mm step over, and the cutter just chewed through it without any hesitation. Even better, I can now do a 4mm step over without the mill trying to shake itself apart. There's definitely vibrations which you can see in the shim stock, but it's nothing like it was before. Definitely an unbelievable result from such a small milling machine. And that's about it for now. Frankly, I'm really happy with the results, and this, coupled with the 3 horsepower motor, means I should be able to tackle a range of big projects that I have planned. Thank you very much for watching, see you next week, take care.